everybody, it's Georgia Weedman, author of Penetration Testing, a hands-on introduction to hacking, and your instructor for this accompanying lab. So now we're going to move on and look at finding vulnerabilities. We got some good ideas about what might be potentially good starting places just from looking at port scanning, but now we're going to move a little further towards, actually exploiting things, which we will get to in a bit, and take a look at finding actual vulnerabilities that we might be able to exploit when we get there. So for this one, we are going to, I actually lied. I said we were done with Nmap for the time being. I thought that Nmap scripting engine was a couple more exercises down, but it turns out it is right after our previous Nmap. So we're actually still doing Nmap if you're doing these in order, which there's no requirement that you do them in order. So if you haven't seen Nmap already, I encourage you to take a look at the port scanning section of the information gathering part of the course, and that will give you the basics of how to use Nmap. We're going to focus specifically on the scripting engine today. So, as usual, start up your lab, grab your lab manual. This one we actually have two targets, so it's going to be .3 and .4, but your IP address is likely going to be different than mine, so be sure that you don't just type in what I type in, and if you're having problems, that would be a good first thing to check. We'll go ahead and go over here to our Kali Linux. Once our lab opens, grab our terminal and pull mine over to the side so my head's not in the way, and do the IP adder, get our IP address. All right, so, let's go back and see what our flags are. The FTP server is vulnerable to which CVE? And CVEs are common vulnerability exposures, so that's just a database of known security issues. And what does the MySQL root user have, or does the MySQL root user have an empty password? Well, for security reasons, I hope not. For pen testing reasons, I hope yes. So I guess we'll find out. And specifically, we're going to use the Nmap scripting engine to do it. So the Nmap scripting engine is built in the language Lua. So if we go to Nkali, user share, Nmap, and then scripts, you can see the built-in scripts. You can write your own, but these are, the ones that come with Nmap. And so we will look at using them. So I'll just go back to root. And so let's just start by doing a basic Nmap of our two hosts. So it's 3 and 4. As I mentioned in a previous video, there are tons of different ways you can specify targets. You can go like that. You can do /24, though this probably isn't a 24. You can do it from a file with -il and give it the file name. There's tons and tons of different ways to do it. Because I'm just going to keep hitting the up arrow, let's just do this for now. So it's .3 and .4 are the two targets for this one. So let's just see what it has to say. So it looks like on .3 we just have FTP, and on .4 we have port 80, HTTP, and 3306, which is the default for MySQL. So you can run the default Nmap scripting engine scripts. The defaults are... They have to be in different categories of, there are scripts that are dangerous. They go in the dangerous category, things could go horribly wrong sort of thing. But the default scripts that are in the safe category and in some other categories as well, you can do -sc. And we can also do, we can go ahead and do the version scanning as well. Why not? So we can do multiple of these. So, and then let's just do one of them, see what happens. So we get that it's very secure FTPD, or VSFTPD 2.3.4 is the version, so different than the one we saw before. And it says that FTP anonymous, we got a bad code, so not too incredibly interesting. Let's see what we get for 4. Maybe it will have something more interesting to say. Let's see, for this one, we got, looks like we've got Apache, says the HTTP title is welcome to a dive, so that might be worth looking up. PHP, so it looks like PHP based web server, MySQL version, protocol information, capabilities. So really just some more information at this point. So we can go from there and, look for specific issues. We can do, let's do this. Let's do dash script and vuln. So that will specifically look for vulnerabilities on the specific target. So since we're doing, vulnerability discovery, that would probably be a good place to start. And, it's going to check for vulnerabilities against the open service. So basically it's going to have, like any vulnerability scanning sort of thing. It's going to have a database of known vulnerabilities, probably pull it from, we talked about CVE. There's also open source vulnerability database. There's some others. And, it's going to have known vulnerabilities, and it's going to have checks. Like if it sees, so this is, port 21 is probably FTP, its version says it's very secure FTP 2.3.4. It's going to look up in its database and say, what are the known vulnerabilities that have been reported for that version? And then it's going to have checks to see, its best guess, without actually exploiting it, hopefully. Or, maybe in some cases actually exploiting it, depending on, the nature of the vulnerability. Being able to tell whether or not that vulnerability is in place, because just because the version had a vulnerability doesn't mean that it isn't patched. I mean, one, the version number could be wrong. Two, it might not change its version just based on, especially if it's something like, it was a vulnerability and they needed to get a quick patch out and they just did that. It may not have changed its version number. So just the version number itself may not be enough to know whether it's there or not. But it looks like, so our FTP server, it says it's vulnerable to a backdoor. It says it's got CVE 2011, 25, 23, also has an open source vulnerability database number. But that's probably the answer to that one question in our flags. And this is actually a really interesting one. I really like this one as an example. This is certainly not the only time this happened. But if we look up like VSFDPD 2.3. Let's type properly. 2.3.4 backdoor. You can find information about it. And what happened in this case, this wasn't a vulnerability in the code itself. Actually, the repository where it was stored was compromised and some additional code was added. So what actually happened is if the username had a smiley face at the end, like a colon and the closed parenthesis, so not the nose, just the eyes and the mouth at the end of the username, it would trigger a backdoor running as well. Root, I guess. Yeah, root. Had to think about it for a second. And it looks like this is actually vulnerable to that. And yeah, it looks like it actually exploited it. I mean, it got a shell and it looks like it's running indeed as root. So, this is a different kind of vulnerability. It's not a buffer overflow. It was, not a vulnerability in the code itself. It was actually just, where it was stored was compromised. So, this happens. This is certainly not the only example of this happening. It does, happen from time to time. So it's, a different kind of vulnerability than you might think about when you think of, you're probably thinking more buffer overflows, cross-site scripting, things like that. But, having a bad guy actually put a backdoor in your product that you don't know about is, everybody's probably worst nightmare. So let's see if we come up with anything on the other one while we're here. And, in addition to that, it says, we saw it that, Rapid7, Rapid 7 makes Metasploit, which we'll see. Metasploit, we haven't seen it yet, but we will spend some time with Metasploit for sure. That's an exploitation framework, so there's a Metasploit module for it. But as I talked through how it works, you can imagine you can probably exploit this by hand just with something like Netcat and just talk to it or just use FTP and give it the smiley face and see what happens. And see whether it's there or not. I mean, this is an example of a vulnerability where, you don't really have anything to lose by exploiting it. If it's not there and it's not exploitable, you're not going to crash the service. It'll just say, oh, the username, Georgia with a smiley face to the end, is not a valid username, and it will go on with its life. So, yeah. All right, this is taking a long time. So while that's finishing up running, I'll just open up a second terminal and let's take a look. I showed you the scripts. So user share Nmap scripts, and we could do like an ls and pipe that into, and we could grep for say MySQL. Oh, whoops. Gotta actually pipe when you're gonna pipe. So I did an ls and I piped that into, and I grepped for MySQL. So it's just showing me, since we know we have a MySQL database, I'm looking, specifically for Nmap scripting engine scripts that have MySQL in the name, because that's likely they're going to be MySQL related. We can do the same thing for VSFTPD. So it does have one for the FTP backdoor, that we talked about as well. Jeez, this is taking forever. What on earth did I do wrong? Oh, it's just taking longer. Anyway, so we'll see that when it finishes. So we can run a particular script. So we can do, one of the questions was MySQL empty password. So, that would probably be a good place to try. So we could do nmap and --script equals MySQL empty password. And then the IP address, which I believe it's on.4. Well, that came up like super fast. Why is this one taking so long? It's oh, you know what it is? I bet it's because it also has the HTTP port, and there's there's a long history of vulnerabilities against Apache. So that's probably what's making it take forever, would be my guess. I should have just specified the port, I guess, and just on this MySQL one. So it looks like the root account does have an empty password. So, MySQL has its fair amount of history with vulnerabilities as well. So that one may be taking a while as well. So it looks like the root account for MySQL actually does have an empty password. So I guess the answer to the second question is yes. And I mean, that's, like I said, that's terrible from a security perspective, but that's pretty great from a pen testing perspective or an attacker perspective. If we can just log into MySQL with no password as root, we can likely from there run system commands. So that will definitely be interesting to us. So, just playing with the scripting engine, we already found, a couple of things that are very interesting. So, that's a good place to start. Like I said, we just looked at a couple of particular scripts. We looked at vulns, which it's still not finished. And let's just kill it. It's not, we saw it with the one. We got the answer we wanted. We needed to find the answer to, what the CVE was. That one not finishing is not particularly that interesting. And we could run other scripts as well. against different targets, that we see. I mean, you'll see there's lots of them. So, it's a good place to start. Definitely running the default scripts, checking for vulns with that vulns option, as well as, looking for particular scripts for the services that you have. And, they may be able to help us answer some interesting questions. Like, we found, it looks like we probably have a backdoor that we can trigger and use that should get us root access to one box. And it looks like we also have MySQL with no password that we can also get into. And like I said, most likely we'll probably be able to run system commands from there as probably root, which will be nice as well. So very good for our exploitation phase. So, that's a little intro to Nmap scripting engine. And now we actually are going to use a different tool. So see you guys next time.